We still have work to do because there are forces in America, in our society at large, that want to take us back to another time, to another place, and we have to say we've come too far. We're not going back.
Hello, and welcome to Washington Post Live. I'm Robin Givhan. I'm Senior Critic-at-Large for the Washington Post, and my guest today is Dr. Carla Hayden. She's the first woman and the first African American to lead the Library of Congress. The Library of Congress is truly one of the most majestic buildings in the nation's capital. It holds more than 170 million items, including the archive of 23 presidents. It's my great pleasure to welcome Carla Hayden.
Thank you. It was something to see in the introduction, Congressman John Lewis, and to think about what he contributed to history and his charge to all of us. And he was such an inspiration for so many, including me.
I absolutely, and I wanted to start because we are in Black History Month, and a lot of comedians often joke that there's Black History Month, but it is the shortest month of the year. And I was hoping you might be able to just give us a little bit of context for why we celebrate it in February, sort of an origin story, if you will.
And I have to smile because I have heard that so many times in my own life. And this is another example of finding out the history of something. Carter G. Woodson, noted historian, was inspired in 1915 by an exhibition to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation. And what he felt and saw and knew was that there were so many aspects of African American Black history that were not discoverable and that were not being presented. And so in 1926, he founded Black History Week. It was a week at first. And the reason why he selected February is because of the birthdays of two significant people, Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln. And that's why he selected February.
So it was not to shortchange.
It was not shortchange. But see, that's what we need. And why did he select those two? What was their significance? They interacted with each other. And so he wanted to bring that to light. And then in 1926, it was expanded. And so it's grown and grown and grown. But that joke is always there.
One of the things that is always intriguing to me is balance between celebrating a particular community's history, but also making it clear that that history is also American history, that it is our shared history. How do you see that balance being played out in the work that the Library of Congress does?
One of the aspects of having a month to highlight something makes it seem as though that's the only time you can examine that history and that it's separated from history throughout the year. And the Library of Congress, as other institutions have tried to do too, was devoted to making sure that there's an American story and many stories and histories that have to be collected. And so, for instance, W.E.B. Du Bois in 1900, the Library of Congress collected his charts and graphs that he used for an exhibition. So this aspect of making sure that the history of different groups is woven in any history you tell. Women's suffrage. The library just did a big exhibit on women's suffrage, and throughout that history was the aspect of civil rights and the fact that there were groups of women of color who were not included in women's suffrage.
One of the things that you have often said or quoted was, or is a line from Frederick Douglass: "Once you learn to read, you will be reading forever." And was that one of the I guess quotations that brought you into the world of libraries? And sort of a second part of that question is, you also have said that you come from a group of people who were forbidden by law to learn to read. So that's such a powerful statement, and to see you where you are now, how do all those things sort of converge in your mind as you think about the work that you do?
And you can see I get animated when I hear that quote again, and just what prompted Frederick Douglass to say that, because there were laws in almost every state that forbade slaves from learning to read. And why was that? Because once you learn to read, you can read about people being freed in the Bible. That was a big conflict. Okay, they wanted slaves to learn to read the Bible, so they, learn about the afterlife, so that their conditions where they are now, don't worry, go to heaven. But then they found that, oh wow, they could read about let my people go. So maybe we'll have, and there's a Bible that is a condensed version for colored people, as they were called. There's a wonderful quote in the book, The History of Reading, by Alberto Manguel, and it's in a chapter called Forbidden Reading. And the photograph starting that chapter has a woman who's outside of a shack. You could tell she probably was a former slave, and she has a book. And what he says is that as dictators, slaveholders, and other illicit owners of power have known, an illiterate crowd is the easiest to rule. And if you cannot prevent people from learning to read, the next best recourse is to limit its scope. And then he goes on about book burning and censorship and all of these things. So reading, and that has been a gateway for me and so many other people, to open up windows to other places, times, to give you an opportunity to go beyond your current conditions and to find hope in history. That's one of my favorite things that I hold dear, that there's hope in history.
When you talk about reading and education and the power of that, I'm reminded that so often there is this sort of stubborn trope that African Americans don't value education as much as some communities. I mean, how do you wrestle with that? And and what would you say in terms of that existing trope and the history that exists and that is on display at the Library of Congress?
And I'm getting animated again, because part of that history goes back to being forbidden to read or learn to read, and having laws that said if a slave was caught learning to read or reading, your fingers could be amputated. You could be beaten. It listed, some states listed how many whips you'd get, and people who would teach slaves to read were punished. And so think about the culture of that time, that the elders or people who were other slaves, if they saw someone learning to read, don't do that, don't do that. That hesitancy with literacy started back in slavery in many ways, and that push and pull. There was also a time that a trope of Black people don't read, and publishers had to realize that maybe if you publish things that reflected their culture and experiences, people would read, give them something that they would want to read. And Terry McMillan, the fiction writer, broke through that for publishing when she put out her books, and people were just reading and eating it up. So the Library of Congress is doing it too. Yeah, so the Library of Congress has been doing that in presenting history, like the Rosa Parks exhibit. But that idea that Black people in particular don't want to read or learn is false.
How does that play into the importance of recognizing who is telling the history? They often say that, the victor, history is written by the victorious. So, how important is it to make sure that all these different stories are told, particularly where we are now in the culture, as so much is changing?
And the importance of being able to tell your own story from your own perspective has been a line through historiography, the technical term for the writing of history. Who gets to write the history? Who has the mechanisms to publish? And so with the new technologies that we have now, there are so many ways, and that's what the Library of Congress is working on now through a wonderful grant from the Mellon Foundation, led by Elizabeth Alexander, who's a poet herself and just understands the importance of providing opportunities for people to tell their own stories, because you can have nuances in how an event is portrayed in history. Is it a riot? Is it a this? We're going through that now. How do you use terms to describe an event in history? Or do you actually downplay that event and not even talk about it? The Tulsa, Oklahoma history is one that has really gotten a lot of attention because of how it's told.
When you talk about, being able to tell your story and considering the kinds of language that's used to tell the story, some people feel that starts to get into this realm of political correctness, that, words have to be chosen to sort of soothe the ego or the sensitivities of other people. Can you tease out a little bit the difference between this idea of sort of reflexive political correctness and the idea that history has many facets, it has many nuances, and depending on what side of a story you're on, it's a different story, or it's a different part of the story?
It's a different part of the story, and that's why you need to turn it around and look at it from so many angles. So you have an event, but what was the 5-year-old who is still living thinking, and what led up to them looking out of a window and seeing people with guns coming after them, but also what did they hear at the table, and all of these types of things. So getting as many viewpoints and opening up the discussion about it and taking it away. And that's what the Library of Congress, other cultural institutions, and so we're all trying to provide a space, a safe space, a trusted space for people to examine history, the monuments, what all of that discussion. Let's step back and see how we got here. History provides context, and if you have these different viewpoints, you might have that empathy, or at least understand that it's not a simple straight line. There were a lot of things that led to where we are now.
How is the library bringing in the papers, the stories from not just this past year, but just in recent years with the racial justice protests, racial injustice protests, and all the things that have been going on with a Confederate flags at the U.S. Capitol? How's the Library of Congress assembling or grappling with this very recent history?
Well, right now we have librarians who have been working with people who have been involved with the different movements, and especially helping them chronicle and make sure that there's a record of, for instance, the posters and the different things that were posted on the fence in Black Lives Matter Plaza. And so the librarians are taking photographs, making sure that things are preserved. And we have over 30 posters and artifacts from Minneapolis, San Francisco, New York, other places, and just making sure that we are looking at contemporary history being made the same way that the Library of Congress did with women's suffrage. One of my predecessors in 1897 was a contemporary of Susan B. Anthony and a neighbor, and knew that what Susan B. Anthony was doing and with the organizations might be important to look at later. And that's what's happening now. So the Library of Congress, Howard University is involved, the Smithsonian is involved. We're all, National Park Service, all working together to make sure that there is going to be a tangible record and a digital record, because that's where the challenge is now too. So many things are being created digitally and are born digital.
Yeah, I mean, how much of the, of social media, the world of Twitter and Instagram and all of that, I mean, how much of that can be captured by the library?
You have to work with the companies. The library was involved with Twitter very early on when it was starting out with the Arab Spring and all of that, and knew that something was going on, that there was similar to those other social movements, because the library has the archive of the NAACP and the Legal Defense Fund and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating, all of these organizations, so that they knew that. However, that did transition into more of a platform for general things. What did you have for lunch? Or what did you have for lunch? And so then that's because, so you capture, and those early days of Twitter are captured in time. We were working with the company to look at access for someone 50 years from now. How did Twitter start? How did that do? And so the most exciting, and I have to say this, one of the most exciting positions in the library world now is in collection development, is what we call it. What are you collecting now that a historian like Doris Kearns Goodwin, or someone that is John Hope Franklin, what would he have looked at? And what will they look at 50 years from now, 100 years from now? And what is that? And that's really exciting, because you're in the moment, but you're also looking to the future.
How does the world of disinformation play into the collection of information and fact and truth that the library holds? I mean, we are in a period when people are having a real difficult time actually understanding what's fact and what is fiction. How does that play into both the collection and the way in which the library engages as a cultural institution?
the Library of Congress, like other libraries and museums, is committed to being a trusted source, that a nonpartisan, partisan, objective source of information. And if you keep that as your guiding principle, it allows you to have a certain remove from the passions of the moment and to present information and vet information and look at the source of the information. And that's what's so important. Where is this information coming from? And even if you collect it and you look at the provenance of the information before you say this is what happened.
One of the things that you mentioned just as we were chatting earlier was the way in which our history is taught in schools, and how, in the past, often the only time Black history came up was in the chapter on slavery. Are we getting better at teaching the full breadth of history in schools, particularly in elementary and high schools?
We're so much better. And even in my lifetime, I've seen a difference. When I was in grammar school and even high school, that was just the beginning. Back when I was in grammar school, there was nothing except that unit. And I shared with you that my mother, who is 89, would ask her mother if she could stay home when they got to the Civil War, because she knew that was when they were going to talk about slavery. And she said she was ashamed because that was the only time someone that looked like her was even mentioned throughout the school year in history. So we have made progress, but there's so much more to do. There is an effort, and part of what the Library of Congress is doing with that wonderful Mellon grant, a 4-year grant to offer opportunities for underrepresented communities to mine the library's collections, but also to document their histories and tell their stories, and to use the newest technologies to do it. Paid internships for students as well. And so, just a little plug, there's a blog that tells all about it, because we want to get people to see themselves in the stories that are being told. It's something when you have to stay at home because you know that that's the only time that you will be mentioned.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like we, as a culture, have a very difficult time grappling with the dark parts of our history. And even now, we like to sort of quickly move on from events, from things that have had a historical impact. Do you see part of the library's mission in forcing us, pushing us to slow down and to consider and sort of sit in our feelings, our concerns, just sort of sit with the facts for a while?
And it's so important to present the information and to talk about why did some, for instance, when you talk about slavery, talk about all of the aspects of it, the rebellions, the quiet rebellions that were going on, the difference in the field slaves and the slaves that were in the big house, but how they worked together, and the messages in the spirituals, the Negro spirituals, as they were called before. All of these things, but to embrace, in a way, the history, the pain, and to look at, there's another spiritual, how we got over. How did you survive? What happened? There's hope in history. So by dealing with the bad parts and the good parts, we talked about even in families, sometimes that happens. So if we're a big family with all types in that family, we need to address those difficult parts as well so we can move forward. There's still going to be more, but You have to look at the history and know that there were those times.
One of the lovely parts of recent history was Amanda Gorman at the inauguration. I know that you have met her when she was quite young, or younger, I should say. She's still quite young. I was hoping that you could talk a bit about the power of poetry, which really seemed to touch people in such a profound way and express things that perhaps they didn't even really quite know that they were feeling.
And that's why the Library of Congress started the Poet Laureate program and cooperates with the Youth Laureate program that Amanda Gorman was part of. And that's what you saw. Tracy K. Smith, the Poet Laureate, was right in the middle because of the power of words. Being able to put things in a simple way and directly to people and to bring out the emotion. And for instance, Tracy was able to go to rural communities and help challenge communities and challenge situations, use poetry as a way to express what they were feeling or to imagine something that they never, if you had to read an entire book maybe, but a poem can capture you and capture you quickly. And our current poet laureate, Joy Harjo, is doing the same thing in terms of Native communities. So using poetry as a voice. Jason Reynolds, the youth ambassador, uses poetry as well. And so there's a gateway to feeling through poetry.
Do you see a connective thread between the artistry of a poet and, say, the artistry of someone like Cicely Tyson, who recently passed away?
Yes, there's a direct line because you need people who can also express it and perform it. And the power of Cicely Tyson and what she represented, she made characters come alive and she made you care. And plus, she was an activist as well. And we have that when we think about other ways that people have been able to express themselves through music, through art. These are all ways and avenues for people to get to history and emotion. Everybody has a different way of connecting, and we have to present different ways for people to be touched.
And I think the last question I think that I probably have time for is just a bit of a personal prying question. It being Black History Month, is there any one or two or three people from history that have particularly inspired you or whose story you feel a particular kindred to?
Ida B. Wells was a journalist, historian, an activist, and I have to put up her picture. I have a librarian at art. She doesn't receive as much attention, but she's so inspiring because she knew that the power of the word would help in advancing things. And also, I have to go back to Frederick Douglass because he knew the power of reading and knowledge and opening up that for everyone and what that can do. So those two people have been inspirational to me beyond the mentors I've had and things like that, but also those two historic figures.
Well, it has been such a pleasure chatting with you. That's unfortunately all the time that we have, but I thank you for being with me this afternoon.
Thank you.
If you have enjoyed our Race in America series, I encourage you to please subscribe to About Us. It's the twice weekly newsletter from the Washington Post that focuses on race and identity. And I'm Robin Givhan. And thank you so much for joining us.